Good morning. Thank you for joining me. It's an honor to dress you today. This year, and I suspect for the rest of my life, today, January 21st, will hold a very specific meaning. It was 1 year ago today, on January 21st, 2020, that I established an incident management team to prepare for the possibility of the coronavirus coming to Oregon. We didn't know what lay ahead, whether the race would be short and steep or long and arduous. But we knew that if COVID-19 reached Oregon, we must be prepared. Now, we know we were in it for the long haul. We were preparing to run a marathon. Just 5 weeks later, on February 28th, we had our first positive case of coronavirus in Oregon. It was just the second person in the entire country confirmed positive who had not traveled abroad. The starting shot had been fired into the air and the long race had begun. For most of us in a marathon, you're not racing against others. You are racing against yourself, against time, and pushing your own limits. You must constantly monitor your performance, adjust your pace, and keep your eyes on the finish line. The goal is not only to finish, but to finish strong. 3 weeks after our first positive case, I closed schools and issued Oregon's Stay Home, Save Lives order. Some folks said it was too rash. Others said it was too late. It was the first adjustment that we had to make in this race. We were falling off our pace. When I decided to close restaurants and entertainment venues, but keep construction and manufacturing open, some said this action was too much. Others said it was too little. But by April, we were back on track. We were even able to send ventilators to parts of the country that needed them more than Oregon. We were showing endurance early on in this marathon. We were ready to take the next cautious step. In May, we began reopening businesses, taking a county-by-county approach. Some said it was too cautious. Others thought it was too risky. We paced ourselves again, adjusting reopening guidelines and establishing the watch list for counties, constantly monitoring our performance and adjusting as we ran. At the end of May and into June, the untimely deaths of Black and brown neighbors from across the country inspired Oregonians to march in our streets with a long overdue clarion call for racial justice. Many of us were awakening to what has always been true. Our Black, Latinx, Pacific Islander, and other communities of color are disproportionately impacted by the crises that befall our nation. As the rest of the country saw a dangerous summer surge, we did too. But our curve was less severe. Oregonians were holding strong. The overwhelming majority were wearing masks and limiting gatherings. And then came September. Fires suddenly and furiously swept through our state. Our friends and neighbors lost their homes. Entire towns were wiped off the map, and smoke filled our skies for weeks. We lost 9 Oregonians. We lost more than 4,000 homes. More than 1.2 million acres burned. And just as we began to steady ourselves from the most devastating wildfires in Oregon's history, the pandemic's second wave hit us last fall. We had to take drastic measures again. This marathon, the marathon of 2020, was proving relentless. Yet, many still said that my orders were too restrictive, that the virus isn't dangerous, or that it's a hoax. All the while, cases were rising and deaths continued to mount. The truth is, those commenting on the far ends of this debate were missing the point. In a short race, like the 100-meter dash, you run as hard as you can for a short period of time. In a marathon, you have to play the long game. Your eyes must remain fixed on the horizon. And just when you think you can't keep going, you take one more step. And even when you're close to the finish line, the final stretch can be the most challenging of all. As vaccines arrived in Oregon, suddenly the finish line appeared. And yet, we had to slow our lives down once again, adjust our routines, and make sacrifices over the holidays. And while we saw record cases and a heartbreaking amount of deaths, Oregonians are still faring better than most of the country. Now, 1 year after we began to prepare for the pandemic, we can see the finish line. But the race is far from over. And yet, because we were cautious, because we listened to experts, because we wore masks and limited our gatherings, because we enforced health and safety rules in businesses, we as Oregonians will finish this marathon, and we will finish strong. Today, Oregon has one of the lowest COVID-19 mortality rates in the country, and our daily case counts are among the lowest in the nation. I directed the Oregon Health Authority to speed up our efforts, and we are now administering at least 12,000 vaccines per day. On some days, we've administered twice that amount. Our healthcare providers, hospitals, pharmacies, local public health partners, and our National Guard have all stepped up and are working together to streamline the distribution process and vaccinate Oregonians more quickly. I want to thank every Oregonian, every business, every local elected official who sacrificed to put us in this position. Thank you for the sacrifices you've made and for the love that you've shown for your families, your friends, neighbors, and the entire state. As the finish line comes into view, I know that many of you are beginning to imagine what life might be like once we reach it. Yet, we must recognize that going back to the way things were will not move us forward. Every difficult turn of this past year has only proven this point, further exacerbating existing disparities for Oregon's Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American, and tribal communities. The first step to creating opportunity is recognizing that racism is endemic to our systems, impacting every part of our culture and our economy. I'm committed to ensuring that the world we build as we emerge from this last year is a more equitable one. We must build back better. As we move forward as a state, we must look back too, to take stock of the more than 1,600 Oregon lives that were lost in the pandemic. With each life comes a story, and over the last year, each life lost also tells the story of those that worked so hard to save it. I want to share with you just one of those people. Dr. Antoine Chavez is a pediatrician at Dornbecker Children's Hospital who is living through the pandemic through our children's experiences. Dr. Chavez, thanks so much for joining us today. Could you tell us how your work has changed at Dornbecker Children's Hospital? I can imagine that your conversations with parents have been a little different over the last year.
Of course, and thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's been a strange year, I guess, for everyone up on the Hill. You know, we've all had to make changes just like the public has in terms of, you know, masking and social distancing in our workrooms, kind of optimizing our use of PPE and, you know, hand hygiene. But also a lot of our conversations with patients are kind of changing as their circumstances change. We have to tailor kind of the things that we talk about. So, to be frank, parents are losing jobs, and there's a lot more financial insecurity, more housing insecurity and food insecurity. And we know that this is disproportionately affecting, families of color. There has been a lot of challenges with distance learning for a lot of families. So we're providing more academic supports than usual to try to kind of bridge the gap or waiting for, for schools to reopen and dealing with, mental health crises as they arise. I mean, there's just a lot right now for families to be anxious about. And that anxiety, kids are smart, and that anxiety trickles down into kids. And so they're asking really big questions about, not just the pandemic, but about, racial tension and political climate. And parents are having really, really big conversations with families. And so as pediatricians, we try really hard to make sure that families know, some of the vernacular and some of the ways to kind of engage with their kids and having these conversations. Really talking about this in the home is the difference between, an adverse childhood event and resilience. And kids, the next wave of children really being able to overcome the anxiety of these current events and be stronger. And they're asking questions about the vaccine. We have a lot of families that are very excited and optimistic that the vaccine is going to be, something that keeps their family safe and keeps the public safe. But we do have a lot of families that have a decent amount of anxiety about the vaccine in terms of how safe it is and how fast it was produced. But as pediatricians and as medical providers, we feel really confident in this vaccine. We feel that it's safe for us and for the community, and we really trust the scientists and the researchers that were useful in creating this vaccine. We think that it could help to keep our families safe and to decrease medical burden, but also use it to keep ourselves safe in our own families.
Dr. Chavez, in addition to treating patients every day, I know that you've also volunteered your time on the Racial Justice Council. Thank you for your help in building back a more just and equitable Oregon. You've also advised on our school reopening plans and how children of color have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. That's one of the reasons I have prioritized the vaccinations of teachers. Could you tell us a little bit about why it's important for these students to be back in the classroom?
I think it's important to acknowledge that comprehensive distance learning is not working for a lot of kiddos in the state of Oregon, and it's not a long-term solution for our kids. As pediatricians, I think we can all think of examples of children that are having to log into distance learning from, the parking lots of their school because they don't have, high-speed internet at home. Or kids with ADHD or autism that just are not able to engage with a computer screen all day long, or kids that don't have special needs that are having a hard time with that engagement as well, that are just not logging on to the Zoom calls and are just getting lost. And we have, families that are refugee families with single parents, and the children aren't able to kind of engage in their own distance learning and understanding of the education system, and the parents can't help them either because of language barriers. The pandemic overall, as you said, is disproportionately affecting families of color, and I'm worried because I feel like we are at significant risk of really widening this racial disparity of educational outcomes, like this already existent achievement gap that exists between children, if schools continue to be closed. And school is more than just education. There are children in school that are medically fragile and have a lot of developmental delay, and they get resources and services through school. Schools are a place where kids get fed and they get exercise. The social interaction, all our research shows it's really, really positive in terms of building self-esteem and developmental skills and language skills and academic achievement. And kids that are in foster care, they get to go and they have a secure, stable adult that they see and get familiarity with. For the school teachers and for the other administrators and other school staff, just making sure that we're keeping them safe is just got to be a priority. And I appreciate that you're doing that because, they're taking care of our kids. They're providing support for our kiddos that come to school with needs that extend far beyond just education.
Well, thank you, Dr. Chavez. Thanks for working to keep our kids and our families safe, and really appreciate your service to Oregonians. So stay safe out there.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. I know Oregon will recover from these turbulent times, but we cannot do this alone. My proposed budget doesn't put enough money into our schools. It doesn't make all of the investments in public health we need. It's a budget built on sacrifice and hard choices. And while our state can deliver the core services that Oregonians expect us to, it doesn't go far enough to heal the pain of 2020. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that everyone, every Oregonian, deserves access to affordable health care. I have proposed investments in my budget to expand this access, but also I expect the Biden-Harris administration to help us financially. Together, we must ensure that every single Oregonian has access to this human right. At the same time, we need to continue the pioneering work that Oregon has done to reduce the costs of health care. Last session, I was pleased to sign Senate Bill 889, which brought hospitals, insurers, and worker representatives together to lower costs for Oregonians. Earlier this month, the Senate Bill 889 work group unanimously approved a framework that will make Oregon a place where people are paying for the quality of the care they get rather than the number of times they visit a doctor's office. I'm committed to moving this framework forward immediately. Finally, as we've seen with the pandemic, broadband, access to the internet, is an essential service just like our electricity. Our kids need to participate in class. Our businesses need it to connect to customers, and our communities rely on it to provide services to their people. My budget invests over $100 million in broadband expansion statewide, with a focus on providing access to the communities that have been disproportionately impacted during the pandemic, and ensuring every single school across Oregon is connected to the internet. This could be a bridge that helps Oregon mend the urban-rural divide. And the disparities in access aren't just a problem here, but across the entire country. The Biden-Harris administration can help unite this unnecessary division, especially in the West, by providing federal funding for broadband expansion. This year, the West was also disproportionately impacted by one of the consequences of climate change, wildfire. In a historic event, hot, dry winds brought on a wildfire emergency that our state has never seen before. None of us will ever forget the blood-red sky. We will never forget what it was like to see thousands of homes burn. We will never forget the lives lost. And we will never forget the sacrifices made by our firefighters, first responders, and emergency managers who saved lives and risked their own. During the wildfires, and even today, months later, I am ever more grateful for the acts of compassion and support I'm seeing in every single community across the state. Even in the darkest of times, Oregonians are stepping up to help one another in extraordinary ways. I want you to meet just one of these inspiring Oregonians, Chief Christina Rainbow Plews of the volunteer Upper Mackenzie Fire and Rescue Department. Many of you likely know of Chief Rainbow's heroism, protecting her community from fire, even while her own home burned. Chief Rainbow, please share your story with us about what happened the night of the fires.
Well, the night of the fires, we did have the forecasted winds came a few hours prior to the fire starting, and the electricity had gone out in the Mackenzie Valley because of lines that had blown down, and so no one had power. And it wasn't too long after the power went out that we were tapped out for a small brush fire at milepost 47.5 on the Mackenzie Highway. In the drive up to respond to the fire. I got a lot of radio traffic from the first responders on scene that things were moving quickly. The fire was spreading rapidly. So they had started the evacuation process as I arrived on scene. An hour or less, we had multiple agencies responding from all over the county, as well as law enforcement, because evacuations had begun. It was pretty clear that we were not going to be able to stop the fire with the resources we had. And the winds continued to present challenges because trees were starting to blow across the road. And the fire was moving faster than we could actually drive our fire trucks. I was still very sure that my house was going to be fine because it was so far down the river, and I knew that there were more resources coming, and I just really didn't worry that much about my house for several days until I found out that it was gone. And then it was just it really hit home how far and how big, how widespread the disaster was. It had traveled 20 miles in just a little bit of time. And my house had not withstood the fire, and neither had my son's home. So I was unable to get anything out. My family got our pets, got some of our belongings, and packed those things up. And I feel lucky that we were able to get the things that we could. I know a lot of the folks in Blue River didn't have enough time to even grab anything other than shoes and maybe the pets, because the fire was in Blue River before we even knew how far it had gone, and it was moving so quickly with that wind. That night, I was very grateful for the people surrounding me, both on my volunteer department, all the folks that responded. Many of them, it was their first brush fire. To fight your first brush fire and have it be a fire of that magnitude is pretty amazing. But I was really grateful that night for all the support. It was really a night to remember.
Oh my gosh, Chief Rainbow, I am so moved by your story. Thank you for your service, and thank you for everything that you continue to do to help Oregonians. I understand that the community has stepped up in ways both little and small to help one another. Could you tell us a little bit about the Tool Lending Library?
There have been a lot of grassroots efforts to help each other, and the Tool Lending Library is a great example of that. It's just built on the honor system. Most folks lost everything, not just their homes, but the tools they would need to rebuild that. And so everyone's coming together. There's donations of tools and generators and fuel, and people can use those to rebuild a storage shed so that they have something to start with, or to start cleaning up their property. Things as simple as shovels and rakes that folks may not have any longer because everything burned. The Tool Lending Library is a great example of everyone coming together and just sharing resources so that everyone has a chance to equally rebuild, regardless of whether they had insurance or whether they have anything left. The folks that do have things are sharing those things, and it's wonderful.
What a great concept. I just love it. Thank you so much, Chief Rainbow. And please tell your family I'm so sorry for your losses, and we're incredibly grateful for your heroic and extraordinary service. Stories like Chief Rainbow's are what tell me that no matter what, we are resilient in the face of so much challenge. Oregonians give me confidence that we will come out of this disaster and we will be stronger for it. For example, we removed 150 tons of household hazardous waste from nearly 2,300 properties, opened up 240 miles of roads, and we continue to shelter and feed over 1,000 wildfire survivors and work to transition these individuals and families to intermediate housing options. There is so much work left to do in order to have a full recovery. And yet, at the same time, we must continue to prepare our communities and our landscapes for these more challenging wildfire seasons. That starts with creating fire-adapted communities to protect our people and the houses they live in. We will invest in the Office of Emergency Management to help communities create response plans and fire evacuation routes and bolster smoke shelter programs at the Oregon Health Authority. Second, we must respond safely and effectively to active fires. This means putting more boots on the ground and investing in new technology like the next generation of air tankers. Third, we must work to prevent fire by creating healthier landscapes. That means coordinating thinning and controlled burning during our wet season to reduce fire risk and increase the odds for our firefighters. While climate change, population growth, and record fuel levels combine to create growing wildfire debt, an immediate response to mitigate fire risks is required. Racism and racial disparities impact every single part of our culture and our economy. The dual crisis of the pandemic and fires have only accelerated these disparities. We know that all Oregonians felt the impacts of the emergencies our state weathered last year, but the impacts are not felt equally. That's why our state budget and policies must be built on a foundation of racial equity and inclusion. I convened the Racial Justice Council last year to guide that work. We confronted some of the most important issues that Oregonians face with the recognition that much of our lives are inextricably tied up in our state's dark history of racism. For far too long in Oregon, our Black, Indigenous, people of color, and tribal members haven't had a meaningful seat at the table. But, as Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm said, if they don't offer you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. I think in Oregon, we can do much better than that. Joining us today are Reina Lopez and Paul Solomon from the Racial Justice Council. Reina works on the BIPOC Small Business Economic Recovery Subcommittee, and Paul is serving on the Criminal Justice Reform and Police Accountability Committee. Reina and Paul, please share with us your experiences working on the Racial Justice Committee. Reina, you said that the council has truly taken to heart the mantra, you can't just talk about it, you have to be about it.
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question. I mean, I think that for me, it really means meeting the moment by leaning into our values and really ensuring that words aren't just words, right? That they have to be actions. People are counting on us for that to be actions and for those actions to be felt in every single corner of the state. For me, it really involves looking deep into my own story of growing up in Oregon and bringing that into what that means, that actual phrase means, like when we talk, not just talking about it, but being about it, and what are the things that would have changed things for me as a person who grew up in Northeast Salem, and what that could have meant for my friends, my family, neighbors in that area that I grew up in.
Paul, would you like to share?
Yeah, thank you, Governor. I think we're really at a unique moment in time. Across the nation, people have gained a heightened awareness of the injustices underpinning many of our public safety practices. And I really believe there's a societal unwillingness to continue to accept it as something that's so ingrained that it just can't be changed. It's been a real honor to serve on the Racial Justice Council and to really honestly consider opportunities to truly reform a system that has perpetuated long-standing injustices in the state. The Criminal Justice Reform and Police Accountability Committee of the Racial Justice Council has begun looking at a range of reforms, including things like mandatory minimum sentencing, qualified immunity for police officers, public defense, immigration, police oversight measures. And we're also looking at key issues related to things like prisoner reentry and restorative justice. Many of the issues that we're trying to address have been generations in the making. Some, like the repeal or reform of ballot measure 11, are very complex. Nevertheless, voices from around the state are really calling on us at this moment to make bold changes and adequately resource underserved communities. Now is our time to act and begin to rebuild a system of justice built on fairness and equity.
Raina, you're working on economic development issues. Can you tell us why it's so important that we support BIPOC businesses, both large and small?
Thank you for that question. And I'm glad that somebody's asking it. And I'm glad the Racial Justice Council is asking that question, because I think that especially this year, when we heard about PPP loans, I think that that's one of the times that we started to really go back into community and say, so is this working for you? And has this type of financial relief worked for you in the past? And have you had access to these things in the past? And unfortunately, what we heard was time and time again was no, it didn't work for us. We didn't get it. And frankly, I think that the moment really called for listening. It called for courage. It called for unity. And it really called for us to bring our full selves into the conversation. I would say that the data points were devastating, but the stories on the ground were even more so, especially because we saw wildfires this year that really affected people all across the state, with COVID, with all of the things that were already pulling our communities down. And I work for an organization that actually serves farm worker communities. So we started off the conversation with a worker lens, and then we were starting to see that the effects were affecting the whole family. And that's how we started to get into the small business conversations with folks, all the little businesses on Front Street in Woodburn, Oregon, that all of those businesses are owned by Latinx, Mexican immigrant, Guatemalan immigrant, folks that opened up their little stores in the community and lost income. We know that a lot of these businesses, not only are they the store owner, but they're also the store worker, and the whole family chips in to make sure that that family is sustained. And I think that just hearing those stories were really a big impetus to being a part of the Economic Development Committee for me. And I think that one thing that we're really excited about moving forward is making sure that people have access to capital, access to being a part of getting a fair shot at COVID contracts, and making sure that people from all across the state get an opportunity to really advance their lives economically. But we know that that has ripple effects on the entire community. So it's been a real honor and privilege to get to sit beside some of these businesses that are paving the way and being trailblazers. But also it's really exciting to get to bring in this other perspective that is also taking into account workers and the whole family and the whole community. And that is something that I think is really different, and it's going to create something that I think is really tangible for people.
Thank you, Raina. Paul, you're really working on services for those who are released from custody. Could you tell us why this work is so important and what we as Oregonians can do to improve the lives of those reentering and being released from custody?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Governor. I think in order for us to talk about reentry, we need to provide a little context as to the conditions under which people are releasing. And first, we need to understand the grand scope of the problem. 1 out of 3 people in the United States today has a criminal history. Our criminal justice system has cast a very wide net. And one of the things that we know is almost every single person we lock up is going to be released. Over 95% of the people we incarcerate return to the communities that they came from. Every year here in Oregon, approximately 6,000 people are released from prison. And what we know about these folks is far too many of them release homeless and indigent. Through my years at Sponsors, I've seen the many ways that people struggle when they're released, and I've witnessed the ways that a safe, supportive environment can literally be the determining factor in whether someone makes it on the outside. I keep doing what I do because I see the difference our work is making, and I believe in the people we serve. They deserve an opportunity to truly re-enter society when their sentence ends, and we're working to give them that. You know, it's been proven that housing is the single most important predictor of a person's successful reentry. Yet people with incarceration histories are 10 times more likely to be homeless. There are simply not enough housing options available to them. At Sponsors, we partnered with Homes for Good, Lane County's Housing Authority, and Lane County Parole and Probation to provide permanent supportive housing to homeless individuals releasing from prison. Just 2 years into the project, we've served more than 115 individuals, and a phenomenal 91% of them are still stably housed and have not become re-engaged in the criminal justice system. And while these outcomes are really incredible, the philosophy behind the project is really quite simple. If people have a safe, affordable home and support in maintaining housing stability, they have the opportunity to not just survive, but to actually thrive. We believe in them, and that helps them to believe in themselves. And this is just one project, and we're just one organization. We need to develop more affordable housing options that are accessible to people with conviction histories. A criminal history shouldn't be a lifelong barrier. Unfortunately, the common practice of conducting criminal background checks often makes it impossible for people to move on with their lives. Conversely, when we work alongside people to help them reclaim their lives, they become contributing community members who pay taxes and support their families. And I firmly believe that after a person completes their sentence, their past shouldn't define their future.
Raina, Paul, thank you so much for your time. Keep up the great work. Really appreciate your service and commitment to creating a more just and equitable Oregon. Our state's and our nation's long history of racist policies won't be deconstructed in one budget cycle. Every step matters. So across my budget, I've found ways to make over $280 million in investments prioritized by the Racial Justice Council. This budget begins the process of recognizing and undoing systemic racism in Oregon. But my fellow Oregonians, I have to be honest with you. This is only the beginning. We are going to have to deploy every resource, every tool, and every creative idea to make progress towards reversing the stain racism has left on our state. And it starts with education. That's why my vision is, and always will remain, creating a seamless system of education from cradle to career. I've invested more than $10 billion in K-12 schools and early childhood education, including investments that prioritize career and technical education, access to wraparound services such as nutritional support, and building an anti-racist curriculum that is honest about the past. We will also continue to make progress toward stomping out the opportunity gap by ensuring 8,000 more kids are eligible for home visiting, early Head Start, and preschool promise. No one should be kicked out of their home in the midst of a pandemic. In Oregon, it was a team effort by the legislature and my administration to ensure that this did not happen. Thanks to Speaker Kotek and President Courtney for their leadership. And late in the year, Congress finally passed an extension of the evictions moratorium and financial assistance for renters and homeowners struggling to make payments. This is only a drop in the bucket. There is much more to do to ensure more Oregon families have a warm, safe, dry place to call home. My budget continues our $250 million investment in affordable housing, homelessness prevention, and rental assistance. We've also included more than $20 million to help provide a pathway to home ownership for Black, Indigenous, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Asian, Pacific Islander, Native American, and tribal communities, as well as adding co-op and land trust models to our system. And as we have learned from Reina and Paul, we cannot continue to operate with two systems of justice in our country, one that benefits the wealthy and harms the poor, one that endangers the lives of Black people going out for a jog or wearing a hoodie, or one that lets white supremacists storm the U.S. Capitol undeterred. Oregon is evolving out of necessity and out of hope. Our policies and practices are changing as we do more listening to those who've been most harmed. Together, these are the steps we must take to begin the work of dismantling racism. Sadly, not everyone in the country believes this. We have seen violence in the name of nationalism and white supremacy veiled as patriotism. We have also seen these hatreds expressed in our communities here at home as they play out in our nation's capital. The intense challenges of 2020 have only reminded us that the foundations of our democracy must remain strong. Now, more than ever, we must fortify the institution that defines us. Voting is a basic, beloved, and essential tenet of democracy. It represents our country's greatest collective strength. And yet today, the fundamental right itself, the very act of voting, has become a political tool for reapportioning power. In recent years, both the federal government and many states have moved toward more restrictive voter registration laws and policies. And like so many reactionary policies proposed in the name of security, you don't have to scratch that veneer very hard to reveal the fear, racism, and political ambition concealed within. That's why I am committed to strengthening this country's democracy, and it starts right here, right in this building. Because in Oregon, voting is a very proud part of who we are. It's in our very DNA. We were the first state in the country to institute vote by mail and to establish automatic voter registration. And today, a remarkable 92% of eligible Oregonians are registered to vote. And Oregon voters showed up in record numbers to cast their ballots in the 2020 election. And in the midst of incredible political divides and a pandemic, Oregon's 30-year-old vote-by-mail system suddenly took a turn on the national stage. States across the country shifted to voting by mail and voting early to enable voters to vote safely and securely. While Oregon's accomplishments are significant, our work is not finished. We must continue to fortify the voting infrastructure we have to ensure that every voice is heard. We must expand our automatic voter registration program to include other state agencies who have the capacity to fully capture eligible voters' data safely and securely. Why? Because voter registration should be safe and easy, whether interacting with the DMV or another state service. We should also allow same-day voter registration and ballots to be counted as long as they've been postmarked by Election Day. At a time when there has never been more scrutiny laid on the systems through which we vote, Oregon set the example and chartered the path to a more safe, secure, accessible, and verifiable voting system. I will advocate for Oregon's innovations in voting to be implemented at the national level. Automatic voter registration and vote by mail should be available to every citizen in this country. The right to vote is fundamental. It is sacred. Your vote is your voice. And in Oregon, as it should be everywhere, every vote matters. My investments and policies for my final 2 years reflect, support, and honor the communities who bore the brunt of the devastation this past year. These are the very same communities that make Oregon the place we all love. I have been awestruck by Oregonians who have run this marathon, stepping up at every turn to protect friends, families, and neighbors. The undaunted and compassionate spirit of our state has truly shined. I end this conversation full of hope, with the finish line in sight and our eyes on the horizon. We have been through a lot together this year, and through it all, we have endured. We have kept pace and lifted each other up, because we are determined to rise, rebuild, and reinvent a more just and equitable Oregon. Thank you.